Hi everyone. Welcome to week 4. We're going to talk here about measurement, which is an important topic because measurements produce the data that often provides evidence and is the sort of a key building block of most research studies. Here's an overview. We'll talk about the definition of measurement, what it is and why it's important, and then we'll talk about sort of some steps in the measurement process, which include conceptualizing what it is you're trying to measure, conceptualizing it carefully, and then operationalizing it, turning it into a set of procedures that can be used to actually produce the data. And then we'll talk about how to evaluate a measurement in terms of validity and reliability. That'll be in later videos. And then a little bit about the level of measurement, which is a way in which measurements are classified. Now, measurement is increasingly important in public policy and in management practice. There's certainly all over the world a push in most fields for the use of performance measurement. It's the use of measurement for administrative purposes or leadership strategy. And it's been increasingly important in government, but not only that, the nonprofit sector, the private sector, foundations, have all pushed for more measurement of the activities and outputs and outcomes of an organization. So what we're going to talk about this week is very much related to sort of getting a handle on performance measurement as an activity. And examples include sort of the use of crime data to manage police departments, or the use of educational testing data to manage school systems, or the UN uses poverty measurements to target development programs. Measurements are just very key now to most fields of public policy and in most management areas. So let's see. And to think about measurement, this diagram I think is really helpful for getting a sense of the overview of the issues that are involved in measurement. So it's a basic model of the measurement process. So let's look at the beginning. Let's look at the center of this diagram. This is the measure, or the data. Think of it as a number, like a number representing body temperature, or a number representing a child's language ability, or a number representing whether a household is poor or not. So that's the data we have. That's usually what we see as the measure. And a lot of what this week is about is how to produce those measures, but also how to evaluate them. How good is this measure as a reflection of reality? Now, the construct over here is the thing that we're trying to measure, and that's sort of the reality, the invisible world that the measure represents. Now, we hope our measure is a good reflection of the construct, and that's really the validity question. Is our measure a valid or truthful representation of the construct that we're trying to measure? So the constructs are things like poverty, or customer satisfaction, or reading ability, the things that we're trying to measure. Often those constructs come from theories or models, and we hope our measure is a good reflection of that construct. So that's the validity question. The problem also comes up in measurement that there are errors. Measurements are carried out by people with instruments and procedures, and nothing's perfect. So there's always some sort of error, random error, that creeps into the measurement that we make, the measurements that we make. So this error produces noise or distortions in the measurement, not necessarily systematic distortions, but just sort of random errors. And that's just a result of the imperfection of the measurement process. We'll talk more about that in the next video, but that's the reliability question. And reliability means sort of how consistent or free of error the measure is. Now, in an ideal world, we want a measure that reflects reality. It's a good reflection of the construct and has a minimal amount of error. And so this gives us sort of a framework. I think this diagram gives us a framework for thinking about some of the issues we're going to come across. So let me move on to the steps in the measurement process. So this is useful if you're thinking about doing your own measurement, or if you're working in a team that's trying to measure something, or if you just want to think about how the government or researchers go about measuring something. So the first step is to conceptualize what you're trying to measure. So in other words, define it carefully. This can include dimensions. Sometimes conceptualizing a measure results in the fact that there may be multiple dimensions, and I'll talk a bit about that later. So after you've defined it carefully, then you need to operationalize it, which means to figure out procedures and instruments and indicators that it can be used to actually produce the measurement. So operationalization is the second key step in the measurement process. So you define it, you figure out how to measure it, operationalize it, and then it's very important to evaluate the measurement. It's not always done, but it's important to evaluate the measurement in terms of its validity. How much does it reflect, how well does it reflect the construct, and its reliability, how much random noise is there in the measurement. Okay, so let's look at some of these steps a little more detail. When we conceptualize a measurement, we start with some ideas of things that we want to measure. They often come from substantive interest in a policy or program, legislation or regulations produce things that we want to, or concepts that we might want to measure. So in the book, for example, we give the definition of the War on Poverty, which was a series of laws that were passed in the 60s to fight poverty, but that led to sort of official definitions of what counts as poverty and an attempt to measure poverty. So sometimes concepts come from laws or legislation. Concepts can come from management initiatives, such as improving customer service. That might lead to an organizational definition of customer service. And of course, theory in the form of logic models and social theory. One of the key functions of a theory is to produce or to identify variables, which then need to be defined. And so, for example, the broken windows theory identifies a variable called disorder, and we need to then conceptualize that concept in order to measure it. So you might want to think about some key concepts in your field that are sort of hot topics or whatever, and think about where those concepts came from and how they were defined. Are there sort of definitions of those concepts, and who defines them? Because that's often the first step in the measurement process. Now, when you define a concept, it often turns out that there are multiple dimensions to the concept. Most things are not as simple as they first appear, and there could be multiple dimensions. So, for example, measuring health is a very important thing to do. There are many health departments and health surveys that try to measure people's health. Health, of course, though, is complicated, so there are multiple dimensions to health. So we give the example of the SF-36, the short form 36 health measure, which turns out to have 8 dimensions of health, including emotional health, physical functioning, role limitations, energy fatigue. There are obviously different dimensions to health. And another good example comes from the UN's attempt to measure poverty in a better way using something called the Multidimensional Poverty Index, and it has at least 3 main dimensions: health poverty, education, and living standards. So just keep in mind that when you define something, or when other people define some concepts that they're interested in measuring, that they may end up with multiple dimensions to the concept. Now, when the concept has been defined, the next step, of course, is to figure out how to measure it, and that's usually referred to as operationalization. In other words, the operations, the procedures that are used to produce the measurement. These can include instruments. Often to measure something you need an instrument like a thermometer, or a questionnaire can be an instrument if you're measuring behavior or attitudes. So instruments are a part of the operations that are used to carry out the measurement process. There are protocols, which is a word referring to procedures or rules for producing the measurement. Often to use an instrument carefully, you need a certain procedure. Questionnaires need instructions and procedures. Those are a part of the measurement process. And then you need personnel to carry out a measurement often. You need interviewers or raters or clinicians to carry out the measurement. And some measurements also involve data sources. Measurements typically produce original data, but sometimes measurements rely on existing data that's compiled in a kind of unique way. So existing data sources can also be a part of the procedures. Now, often you can't measure something directly, so researchers will sometimes use a proxy to measure something. A proxy is the idea that some things can only be measured indirectly. A good example of this is the measurement of poverty in schools. School systems don't really collect income data, so one proxy for the income of a family is whether they apply for and qualify for free lunch or not. So education researchers typically use free lunch eligibility as a kind of proxy for a family's income, and just because they can't get the actual income data from school systems. Now, interestingly, that's kind of changing because many school systems are doing away with the income eligibility for free lunch because of some issues about whether families are going to actually, that discourages families from taking up free lunch. Now, a proxy is a good way to begin thinking about what's called an indicator. In some ways, all measurements are proxies of a sort. There are observable indicators that represent more abstract concepts. In some ways, what's a proxy and what's an indicator is a continuum, and all measurements rely on some observable indicators that represent potentially unobservable constructs. This takes us into the topic of scales and indexes, which are widely used in many fields to measure things, particularly things that are hard to measure more directly. So a scale is a composite measure, an aggregate measure of multiple indicators that are, in a sense, put together to represent a single measurement of something. So there are many examples of this. The Consumer Price Index is a measure of prices that is produced by a basket of goods and services that are priced and then averaged together. So the CPI is, in many ways, a good example of an index of prices across the economy. Something as simple as a grade point average. You all have grade point averages from your undergraduate studies and from your graduate studies. Grade point averages are an index of your overall sort of performance in school, which are an average of your grades in multiple classes. And then there are scales that are used in social research that come from surveys, in which multiple questions or multiple items on a survey are put together to form a scale. And a good example of that is the well-known self-esteem scale, and we give a diagram of that here in the book. And this gets us back to the original model measurement that we were looking at. So here's the self-esteem scale, which has 10 statements which a person agrees or disagrees with. Those can be thought of as indicators of the underlying construct of someone's real, self-esteem. And so their answers to the questions are, their answers to these 10 statements are a reflection, hopefully, of their real self-esteem. And the reason we would use a scale and have 10 items is partly because of these random error terms. Each question has a random error component to it, like all measurements have a random error component to it. But the good thing about a scale is if we average together these 10 items, we kind of average out the error terms. It's kind of like the carpenter's adage of, measuring twice and cutting once, because then you kind of, if you're a little bit over or a little bit under in your measurement just because of random, kind of errors in the use of a tape measure or whatever, if you average them out, you cancel out those errors, at least to some extent. So that's the idea of a scale too. You use multiple items or indicators in order to average out the errors and produce a more reliable measure of the construct self-esteem.